Hey there, the past 4 videos on this channel were actually designed to function together as a unit, so I thought it might make sense to actually just cut them all together to make 1 hour-long presentation. What I wanted to convey with these 4 videos is that the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, actually has the potential to do a lot more than just resolve issues in diplomacy with Iran or function against nuclear non-proliferation. I think that the JCPOA really does have the potential to solve some serious long-term problems in the United States. With these 4 videos, I laid out that case. I don't actually even mention the Iran nuclear deal until the beginning, or rather the end of the second video and the beginning of the third. But if you look at them all together, I think you'll see the way that this whole thing functions together as one presentation. The first video focuses on the limited political question of how Biden can best beat Trump. Yes, I'm not a Donald Trump fan, but I'm not someone who thinks that he's the root of the problem here. I think Trump was a symptom that came out of the real problem, which is the fact that the U.S. national security state is becoming more and more powerful. That's what the second video goes into at great length, and points out that the best way to strike a blow against the national security state that tanked Hillary Clinton's candidacy and tanked Donald Trump's presidency is actually to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. In the third video, I enlarge and the way that the JCPOA can actually solve that. And then I go beyond that and try to make an argument in the terms that foreign policy hawks would understand, and point out that if we're serious about competing with China, then we really want to get back into the Iran nuclear deal anyway, even if my crazy hippie pacifist way of looking at things doesn't make any sense. Not that I'm a pacifist. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. I'm very proud of these videos. I think they do function together as a whole, and I hope some people find this useful and interesting. Thanks. Hey there. As we survey the damage and struggle to emerge from 4 years of Trump, one question should be on our minds above all others. How do we make sure this never happens again? Donald Trump could very well run for president again in 2024, and if nothing changes significantly about the U.S. political scene, he could very well win. So how can Joe Biden stop the next Donald Trump presidency? Today, I'm going to propose 3 possible strategies. Donald Trump made a powerful appeal to those who felt left behind by our whiz-bang financial, technological, and primarily coastal economy. Over the past 40 years, we have intentionally crafted a system where the winners do better and better, and most people do worse and worse. There were arguably good reasons to do this at the time. In the 1970s, it's conceivable that the country was too equal to innovate the way it needed to. It might have made sense to give the wealthy a few more incentives to invest and come up with new stuff. Wherever the right balance was, we hit it at some point before 2008, and we have kept on accelerating in the same direction long past the point of diminishing returns. Donald Trump was elected on a promise to do more for the little guy, but all he ended up delivering was a massive tax cut that made the rich even richer. A lot of folks are already impressed with Joe Biden's moves in this direction. The new stimulus apparently included some pretty impressive new anti-poverty measures, and it seems like the Democratic Congress and the Wall Street figures that own it are a lot less obsessed with the pro-austerity balanced budget mindset than the Obama administration was. There are a lot of quick and easy things that could be done here, like enforce the labor legislation that's already on the books, or give the IRS the money it needs to enforce tax legislation. And there's some bigger picture stuff too, like, fixing our horrific healthcare system, or doing some ongoing stimulus through much needed infrastructure spending. I am much more optimistic about the chances for this strategy than I was back in November. That Senate election in Georgia in January really was a game changer. But there's a lot of difficult and long-term work to be done on this issue. And as the Trump crises fade, people are going to get a lot less willing to do that work. And even if Joe Biden proves to be an effective fighter against inequality, positive results might not even show up in time to win the election for the Democrats in 2024. It's obvious that Joe Biden is not going to solve racism. Racial tensions are as American as apple pie, and they are eternal. But they can be changed by a president. Donald Trump just provided a masterclass in making racial tensions worse over the past 4 years. Interestingly, the best way to improve things with this issue would actually also be to work to solve inequality. The fact that I think these two concepts are directly linked may be surprising to those of you familiar with Twitter wars over which concept is more important to the rise of Trump. Many in the US's right-wing marketing segmentation like the inequality explanation, while many in the left-wing marketing segmentation like the racism explanation. But for those of us who think of politics as more than just a team sport, it's obvious that these two issues are directly linked and feed off of each other. If life gets worse, as it has for like 80% of Americans over the past 40 years, it becomes more attractive to hate the other, whether that's on a racial, ethnic, or even a gender basis. And that's exactly what's been happening. Donald Trump's genius, to the extent that he had it, was his ability to ball all these resentments into real power at the ballot box. As I said, early progress on inequality has been better than I expected, and perhaps that'll feed back into positive developments on race relations as well. I hope it does. Unfortunately, I think it's more likely that the COVID-related spike in violent crime will lead to a return to the racist politics of mass incarceration that seemed so dead in the water just 2 years ago. After all, President Joe Biden has some experience with those politics. I'm also getting a little irritated by the way that we're expected to be so excited that our war machine and our financial apparatus is now controlled by more diverse and female executives. Like, wasn't it diverse and woke and fun the way we killed all those anti-ISIS militia members in Syria a couple weeks back? Yay. The truth is that both inequality and racism are tremendously difficult problems that Biden and every president that comes after him are going to have to work to solve. If I were Biden, with his tiny congressional majority and his desperate need to hold on to the popularity he has and somehow get more, I would look for the easiest, lowest hanging fruit. And that's what the rest of this video and the upcoming videos over the next few weeks are going to be about. The easiest, lowest cost way that Joe Biden can do an end run around Donald Trump and steal one of his most popular issues. If Joe Biden can make serious strides in this very popular, morally right, and fiscally responsible direction, there's a distinct chance that he could sweep the midterms, allowing him to make even more progress on racism and inequality. Ending the forever wars, or at least seriously dialing them back, would also rob the Donald Trumps and Tucker Carlsons of this world of their very best issue. It is a no-brainer, but it doesn't seem to have been a priority in the first months of the Biden administration. The problem is that a number of foreign policy hawks have managed to convince high-level Democratic and media figures that Donald Trump was somehow a foreign plot and that aggressive pushing of that idea was key to his defeat. This couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, as I've been saying for years, aggressive U.S. foreign policy and the people who make it are one of the main reasons we got Donald Trump in the first place. Every night we see people like Robert Mueller, James Comey, James Clapper, David Frum, Max Boot, and a wide cast of intelligence community freak shows and war on terror propagandists lionized by people on CNN and MSNBC who should really know better. All these frickin' resistance neocons are the reason Donald Trump is president. For 15 years after 9/11, they lined their pockets with war on terror nonsense. To do this, they created fear. Fear of Muslims, fear of foreign countries, fear about our borders, fear of the disappearing crime in U.S. cities. Donald Trump is the result of their failures and the fear that they have created.
In my opinion, we've spent $4 trillion trying to topple various people that, frankly, if they were there and if we could have spent that $4 trillion in the United States to fix our roads, our bridges, and all of the other problems, our airports, and all of the other problems we have, we would have been a lot better off. I can tell you that right now. We have done a tremendous disservice, not only to the Middle East, we've done a tremendous disservice to humanity. The people that have been killed, the people that have been wiped away, and for what? It's not like we had victory. It's a mess. The Middle East is totally destabilized, a total and complete mess.
Trump was exactly right about that. If he was actually the whip-smart executive he played on TV, then maybe he would have been able to make some real progress on these issues. But he's not. What Trump actually is one of the sheep. He's been sitting in front of a TV for 17 years, eating up all the fear and hate that the James Comeys of this world have been using to win votes and sweet jobs at military contractors like Northrop Grumman. People like Comey aren't evil. They probably believe that all the fear they have cooked up is worthwhile. It helps them fulfill their fantasies of public service and heroism. And with serious people like themselves in charge, all this fear can be controlled. Well, that's over. Donald Trump is a true believer. He lives and breathes all that fear and hate that the James Comeys of the world created to keep their jobs after the Cold War ended. And it is a terrible thing to watch. What the national security state pulled off while Trump was in power is extraordinary. They used Trump to heighten tensions all over the world, but they also managed to convince the Democrats that those heightened tensions were necessary to defeat Trump, and they should continue now that he is gone. These foreign policy professionals have somehow managed to rig the game so that defense budgets and weapons sales go up no matter who is in power. And to make it all worse, it's all a complete waste of time and money that hurts the U.S. national interest. In January of 2018, U.S. policy changed dramatically. Since 2001, the main foreign policy priority of the United States had supposedly been fighting terrorism. I have a 40-plus video series called Everybody's Lying About Islam on how useless that effort has been, but at least it was something the American people thought they wanted. With January 2018's new defense strategy, the Pentagon quietly announced a shift to great power competition against countries like Russia and China. This seismic shift went largely unexamined because we were all too busy watching the President Trump show. The only nice thing about this shift in strategy is that it's a little more honest. In truth, the United States has been pursuing a tremendously counterproductive policy of great power competition for the past 30 years as well. We have a tremendously expensive foreign policy establishment that was built to fight the Cold War. And for the past 30 years, it has kept on fighting the Cold War, even though the Soviet Union voluntarily dissolved itself decades ago. It kept on fighting the Cold War even after it supposedly had something better to focus on after 9/11. Our main target for much of a century now has been Russia. When this competition started, the Soviet Empire outweighed the US population by tens of millions of people, and the Cold War opened with their ideology swallowing up whole continents. 70 years later, the Soviet Empire is gone, Russia has embraced a crappier version of our guiding ideology, and there are almost 200 million more of us than them. Despite all the hype, in the 6 years since NATO expansion finally turned them rogue, Russia isn't taking continents. It's largely failing to take individual provinces of its old empire. If anything, our competition with China is even more farcical, as I've covered recently. I'll talk more about our absurd conflict with Iran in the coming weeks. The problem with all of this is that it's mostly meaningless until it isn't. Obama let a bunch of foreign policy hawks convince him to do stupid things in Syria and Libya, which led directly to a massive European refugee crisis and the foundation of the Islamic State. It's easy to forget now that we are all moving on to China panic, but the very cable news friendly threat of the Islamic State and Trump's catering to it with a Muslim ban were a big part of his victory. Trump won by the difference of a few tens of thousands of votes in just 3 states. If it weren't for the catastrophes brought to us by the foreign policy blob, Donald Trump would have never been president. That's the key thing here for U.S. politics. The downside risks of our forever wars and the great power competitions we keep pushing are massive and unpredictable. At this early point in the Biden administration, it can seem easier to just sort of stick with the status quo and not upset too many defense industry apple carts and not upset too many congresspeople in both parties who are owned by the defense industry. This may seem like the safer approach, but it's really not. There's a lot of time between now and 2024, and there's a very good chance that our constant aggression all over the world will produce another issue that's perfect for Donald Trump. But there is good news here. One of these things is not like the others. Inequality and racism are perennial problems that will always be with us. What's more, the president has pretty limited powers to deal with these domestic problems. The forever wars? According to the Constitution and most U.S. laws, Biden can wake up and stop them tomorrow. Now, obviously, it's not that easy. Trump showed that by his complete failure to get out of Syria and Afghanistan, 2 things he seemed to sincerely want to do. But Biden, even if he is somewhat diminished, really does know how government works and has hired at least a few intelligent people who are eager to help him get it done. Trump didn't know anything and almost exclusively hired pro-war people. Biden should end the forever wars and start taking a saner, less militaristic approach to great power competition. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smartest thing to do for the success of his presidency and his party. It's also the best way to stop Donald Trump. The only thing standing in Biden's way is the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Whether you know it as the blob or the deep state, or as I do, as the metastasized military-industrial complex, I believe that it is the greatest threat to the survival of this country and the world. Come back next time to hear more about the way that the blob has taken over U.S. politics. Hey there, last week I made the obvious case that the easiest and best path to political success for Joe Biden is ending the forever wars and cutting off the U.S. foreign policy community that is right now working to restore the geopolitics of the run-up to World War I. Today I want to talk about that foreign policy community, what it is, who it is, and the way that it works against the interests of U.S. voters. We've got a ton to talk about today: the Russia hoax, the Iran panic, sort of outline of the metastasized military-industrial complex, and the biographies of 2 of its more amusing members. But to start off, I want to talk about a disturbing fact that everybody knows, but nobody seems to want to talk about. The fact that the FBI determined the result of the last 2 U.S. presidential elections. It may not fit the dictionary definition, but I am completely comfortable saying that the results of the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections were both coups carried out by the FBI. the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, a branch of the U.S. military-industrial complex. Now, as crazy as that sounds, it's important to lay out that nobody really disputes the facts that I'm about to lay out here. It's just that people are too caught up in looking at politics as sports teams and don't pay attention to the more difficult reality. Because that reality is actually pretty scary. Hillary Clinton was a heavy favorite to win the 2016 U.S. election. But then the U.S. National Security State got involved with the endless Benghazi investigation. Crucially, and we see this again and again, the investigation was strictly limited to Hillary Clinton and other political figures chosen by elected officials. It's only the folks who represent the will of the people that ever get investigated. In fact, the investigation carefully avoided any broader questions of what the hell the U.S. government was doing in Libya in the first place. It was always focused, for years, on one bad day. Broader questions of U.S. foreign policy and the people who make it never came into the discussion. The Benghazi investigation found nothing, but in the process, it did reveal that Hillary Clinton, an elderly figure surrounded by yes-men, had failed to keep up with changing government regulations regarding the preservation of emails. This controversy spent years dominating the headlines through a series of press releases and reports from various government agencies. The FBI quite straightforwardly used this investigation to tank Clinton's presidential run. Despite declaring in July of 2016 that Hillary Clinton had committed no crime with her emails, FBI Director James Comey publicly declared the reopening of the investigation on October 28, 2016, just 11 days before the election. In a contest that was decided by a few tens of thousands of votes, the FBI gave Donald Trump the presidency. Then it took it away from him. Donald Trump was a phenomenally unprepared and disastrous president. There is no doubt in my mind that he is the man most responsible for the failure of almost every aspect of his presidency. That does not mean it was okay that the U.S. intelligence community made it its mission to thwart him at every turn. He was our elected president. This is not the way things are supposed to work. Trump and his clowns provided an embarrassment of riches for FBI investigators. They were far out of their depth, and they made a series of obvious mistakes that no sensible adult professionals ever would have made. His team was without the suave lawyers and polished political operators that have filled most presidential administrations for the past century. Yes, those investigations really underlined how unfit for office Donald Trump was, but that's not the FBI's job. Our U.S. intelligence community spent 4 years laying traps for Trump's idiots, but that's not their job either. Democracy means we're going to occasionally elect idiots. The point of our permanent foreign policy establishment is to make those kinds of situations less embarrassing, not more. Our foreign policy establishment should not be working to embarrass elected presidents, no matter how bad they are, and they should not be working to determine the results of the next election. But that's pretty much what happened here. 2 U.S. elections and 2 FBI coups. It's important to point out that just like the Clinton investigations, the investigation of Trump was carefully limited. There was no discussion of the fact that an ostensibly Democratic administration basically gave Donald Trump a hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. in 2013. There was no investigation of Trump's sordid relationship with the Saudi royal family and other big purchasers of U.S. weapons. No, the Mueller investigation represented a large commitment of prosecutorial resources aimed directly in the same direction the U.S. military-industrial complex has always pointed itself, at Russia, Russia, Russia. I've been complaining about this for some years now. The number of supposedly progressive people that are out there defending the CIA right now is deeply disappointing. What nobody seems to be asking is, what do these agencies get out of going to such lengths to embarrass Trump and Russia? What do they get out of this? What they are doing is protecting a line of business. They are trying desperately to keep Trump from bringing about a real peace or real settlement with Russia. They find this prospect terrifying. And after 2 years of hullabaloo, the Mueller investigation didn't end up producing much. Even the famous story of Russian Facebook manipulation turned out to be mostly bullshit. The DOJ dropped the charges against any Russian companies that bothered to show up in court. And do you remember Maria Butina, the famous Russian spy whose reputation the US media so gleefully destroyed? Well, she's already back in Russia because the FBI couldn't prove anything beyond the standard shady lobbying that many countries carry out in Washington, D.C. every single day. In the final analysis, the Mueller investigation didn't find much because it really didn't seriously look for anything. It completely achieved its main objective, making the world safer for the U.S. defense industry and guaranteeing that nobody credible or competent would go to work for an elected U.S. president. Now, I'm not saying that there were no partisan political elements between these two FBI coups. There absolutely were. Clinton isn't wrong to talk about a vast right-wing conspiracy, and there definitely were a range of media organizations who made crusading against Trump their bread and butter. But these explanations only go so far. Many folks on the conservative side fantasized about the Durham report and how it was going to reveal a smoking gun that would lead to the arrest of Susan Rice or maybe even Biden or Obama. Democrats imagined that any one of a number of semi-literate Republican congressmen were Hillary Clinton's true persecutors. These fantasies serve to cover up a darker truth. The sad fact is that we are already a decaying empire whose leaders are chosen by the security services, sort of our own Praetorian Guard. The FBI and the Department of Justice were the instruments that decided the last two elections, but they represent just one part of what I like to call the metastasized military-industrial complex. There are rivalries between different elements of our permanent government and our defense industries, but they also have interests in common that are far more important than the left-wing and right-wing marketing segmentations our cable news channels and political parties tell us to care about. All of these organizations and people are dedicated to convincing the US public that the world is more dangerous than it actually is, because their budgets and their individual careers depend on that fear. Over the past 30 years, these professionals have actually worked, intentionally or unintentionally, to make the world more dangerous than it was. And loyalty to this fear can carry an individual across this complex in interesting ways, regardless of political or bureaucratic dividing lines. One of my favorite examples is James Comey, whose most serious adult job outside of the Department of Justice and the FBI, nominally domestic law enforcement organizations, was working for Lockheed Martin, one of the country's biggest sources of military and international arms sales. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about this sort of corruption 60 years ago, but I think things have gotten a lot worse since he popularized the concept of the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. The military-industrial complex is metastasizing. It's not the thing Eisenhower warned us about 50 years ago. It's much, much bigger. The crucial element is time. For 50 years, this system has been growing. Defense contractors now include a surprising number of businesses you would never think of, but the U.S. military buys a lot more than just guns. Military money funds an immense ecosystem of journalism, universities, and think tanks, all of which are knowingly or unknowingly dedicated to the continuation of the current system. In Eisenhower's day, there were people in government, media, and academia who remembered an era before militarization. Those people are now all dead. Very few working within this system can even see how absurd it is. And it is indisputably absurd. Now, it's all well and good to talk about this in the abstract, but I don't think I've done a very good job on this channel of drilling down to the way this looks in individual day-to-day careers. The truth is that the policy and the personnel changes very little from one presidential administration to the next. And this policy, since the end of the Cold War, has been uniformly disastrous. Not just disastrous in terms of the millions of foreign lives lost, but also directly opposed to the U.S. national interest in a peaceful world that's open for business. A great way to look at this consistent failure and consistently rewarded failure is to look into the careers of just one married couple. Robert Kagan, the undeservedly more famous member of the pair, got his start destroying regions in Latin America with the Reagan administration in the 1980s. His business in the State Department was propaganda, and he was so successful in defending the Reagan administration's backing of death squads in Central America that the victims from those devastated countries are still fleeing to our border to this day. In the 1990s, Kagan helped found the Project for a New American Century, a now-defunct think tank that argued for a more interventionist United States. It was with the invasion of Iraq that Kagan probably reached the peak of his fame and influence. He wrote the most eloquent justification of the Bush administration's foreign policy, a foreign policy that led to the deaths of 1 million people and counting, and the reduction of another of the world's regions to a smoking ruin. You would think that this horrific failure would have led to him being drummed out of politics and media. You would be wrong. He's a member in good standing of the Council on Foreign Relations and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Every 6 months, he writes some big think piece in Foreign Affairs of the Wall Street Journal that we're all supposed to respond to and take seriously. In 2016, this famous Reagan and Bush supporter became a Hillary Clinton fundraiser, which isn't surprising when you consider the career of his much more powerful wife, Victoria Nuland. Nuland quietly amassed progressively more powerful positions in foreign policy under Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And we never would have heard of her if it weren't for a famous conversation leaked by the Russians.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
In 2014, Nuland was in charge of the Obama administration's policy in Ukraine. This conversation was leaked in February of 2014.
And, the EU.
So that's the bit that became most famous and made for better headlines, but I've always found the other part of the leaked conversation more compelling.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
You see, this was leaked before the coup in Ukraine actually happened. That was Nuland basically organizing the government that would replace Ukraine's popularly elected president after the 2014 coup. What followed our coup was the Russian annexation of Crimea and the death of thousands of Ukrainians in a Russian-supported uprising elsewhere in the country. This was the genesis of the first major shooting war in Europe since the 1990s, the solidification of Russia as a rogue state, and a fault line that still kills people to this day over 7 years later. And Nuland's name is on it directly. So I guess you would expect her to have been fired, right? If not for everything else, at least for offending the EU. Right? Hell no. Obama thought she was doing such a great job that he kept her there for another 3 years. And amazingly, Biden has nominated her to be one of his undersecretaries of state. She hasn't been confirmed yet, and that could prove to be difficult, but it is mind-blowing that she was even proposed. You really can't make this stuff up. Now, I don't want to hold this particular couple up for any special ridicule or contempt. They are slightly more successful representatives of thousands, or maybe even tens of thousands of hardworking, clever professionals who probably legitimately believe they're doing the right thing. The fact that the death and destruction they cause pays for their mortgages probably keeps them from seeing the death and destruction that they cause. These are not evil figures. They are tragic figures. But the fact that they are not bad people does not obligate us to follow their insane advice. When you realize that it's the same people running the foreign policy in all of these administrations, even the Trump administration, you can begin to see that their strategies are very similar. The FBI investigations they use to control and discredit elected politicians become more obvious. Strategies that are supposedly political in a Democrats versus Republicans sense are really about the military-industrial complex versus all of us. The best examples of this might be the Russia hoax and the Iran panic, which are basically the same thing. Republicans rightly see the conspiracy theory that Trump was working for Russia as a hoax put about by the deep state. But those same Republicans are eager to promote deep state conspiracy theories about Obama and Iran. The better kind of Democrat is outraged at the foreign policy blob that keeps attacking Obama's biggest diplomatic achievement, the Iran nuclear deal. Yet those same Democrats are eager to work with the foreign policy blob to promote the Russia hoax. This, of course, doesn't serve any political party. It, in fact, works directly against both of them. It serves the interest of the military-industrial complex. And yes, if it wasn't clear already, the deep state and the foreign policy blob are the exact same people. Why don't we close with a World War II analogy? After all, that's the only history that anybody in Washington, D.C. seems to be aware of. A lot of folks claim that Trump was the new Hitler. That's unfair, but let's run with the analogy. So if Donald Trump was Hitler, then the foreign policy establishment was Stalin. We worked with the foreign policy establishment to defeat Trump, but now that that's been done, it's time to Cold War against the foreign policy establishment. There's a lot of free-floating outrage in the United States right now. We've spent the past 4 years being so angry at Trump or angry for Trump that we don't really know what to do with ourselves now that he's keeping a lower profile. Well, I'd like to humbly suggest that instead of getting angry at Major League Baseball or Dr. Seuss or anybody over the age of 40 who works at the New York Times, maybe we should unify as a country and aim our outrage directly at the national security state that just picked our last 2 presidents for us. Next week, I'll talk about the best way to go after these guys, pressuring Joe Biden to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. Hey there, I complain a lot on this channel. People I respect have made the criticism that I never provide any solutions to the many tragedies I document. I just whine about them. Well, today is different. This video is about a solution that is here, that is easy to get back into, and that one that I believe could quite literally save the world. I'm talking, of course, about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, commonly known in the United States as the Iran nuclear deal. With these 2 videos, I'm going to make 2 very different arguments that might as well exist in different worlds. With today's video, I'm going to talk about reality as I see it. I'm going to talk about a world that still admires the United States and wants to trust it, but is getting sick of the way our aggression has repeatedly led the planet into disaster over the past 2 decades. With the next video, I'll make the argument as if Washington, D.C.'s fantasy world is real. This is the world pushed by most US and European media, where Russia, and especially China, pose some meaningful threat to world stability, and the US needs to wage a new Cold War against them. In both of these worlds, the real world and the Washington, D.C. fantasy world, and quite probably in infinite Earths beyond them, the Iran nuclear deal is the right thing to do. The JCPOA is the next right step, whether you are a committed anti-interventionist like myself, or you're deeply concerned by China's rise and you believe that Taiwan is in imminent danger. But there are some other ways that my reality and the Washington, D.C. fantasy world converge that I should mention before I get into this. Longtime viewers know this about me, but more casual viewers might be surprised. I am a fierce advocate of the U.S. world system. I talk about the mistakes all the time because I want Washington, D.C. to make fewer mistakes. I believe that the world has gone through an almost supernatural period of peace for the past 75 years, and I believe that the U.S. world system, even with all the horrors, and there have been many, many horrors, has been key in keeping the human race from annihilating itself. If the current U.S. world system ends the same way the British world system did, with 2 massive world wars, civilization as we know it is unlikely to survive. That's why I wrote a book called Avoiding the British Empire, by the way. You should check it out. There's a link in the description. So my reality converges with the Washington, D.C. fantasy world in some really important ways. I believe that the U.S.-led order, in the final analysis, is good. I believe it is deeply threatened. Where I differ, however, is where the threat is coming from. It's not the ever-growing selection of outside forces that Washington, D.C. wants you to give them ever bigger defense budgets to face. No, the threat is coming from inside the house. It is the almost unbroken string of calamitous foreign policy failures that Washington, D.C. has inflicted on us over the past 30 years that has created almost all of these supposed foreign threats. And it is the continuation of those failures and the rewarding of the people responsible for those failures that is the greatest threat to the U.S. world system. That's the beauty of the JCPOA. And the reason Washington, D.C. is fighting so hard against it. It is capable of stopping this process of compounding failure. The deal already exists. All we have to do is get back into it. There are plenty of smart people who are making the technical case for the Iran deal today. It's one of the most sweeping and restrictive arms control deals in diplomatic history, and it is tremendously one-sided in the U.S.'s favor. Over the past 2 decades, we invaded and destroyed Iran's 2 biggest neighbors, and we're certainly not giving up an iota of military or peaceful nuclear capability in the deal. The people who tell you that the deal isn't complete until Iran has given up its entire foreign policy and all its allies and its entire ability to defend itself are fundamentally dishonest and should be ignored. They don't want a deal, they just want to preserve an enemy and preserve defense budgets in the US and Israel. In fact, nuclear Iran and a cascade of nuclear proliferation across the Middle East might actually be better for the US military-industrial complex. Real danger is great for defense budgets. There's an argument that it was actually the Bush administration's killing of a Clinton-era deal with North Korea that led to that country's nuclear bomb. And senators like Tom Cotton and Bob Menendez might be eager to do a repeat performance. But I don't want to talk about the minutiae of the deal. Today, I want to talk at a higher level. As Trita Parsi puts it in his informative book on the topic, the real point of the Iran nuclear deal is losing an enemy. The point of the deal is not the deal, but to move beyond the deal and welcome Iran back into the community of nations. With the incendiary issue of nuclear weapons handled, Iran will be free to negotiate as a peer on other issues. And one of the world's greatest flashpoints can finally calm down. This is why the complaints about inspections time limits and the Iran nuclear deal have always struck me as so unhelpful. The whole point of the JCPOA is to get the United States and Iran to the point where Iran no longer needs such an invasive inspections regime to prove that it doesn't have a nuclear bomb. Iran has been a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1970, and that treaty imposes all sorts of limits. If we can just get to the point where the most powerful country in human history is no longer threatening to destroy Iran on a monthly basis, well, then Iran will have no reason to work for a nuclear bomb anyway. There are 2 standard arguments that are advanced against that happy vision I just laid out there. Well, in a weird turn of events, over the past 4 years, Donald Trump has just completely demolished both of those arguments. When supporters of diplomacy point out that Iran signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the argument is, well, you can't trust those crazy mullahs to really cooperate with any serious deal. You're just giving them more time to make a bomb. Well, for the past 5 years, the Iranian government has scrupulously complied with the most invasive arms control inspection regime in diplomatic history. And they've continued to do so over the past 3 years after the United States exited the deal and every benefit that Iran was getting stopped. Donald Trump has proved that Iran is very, very good at following the letter of the deals that it signs, in stark contrast to the United States. The other standard argument is that because of religious fanaticism, the Iranians have a suicidal lust for blood and are incapable of acting rationally. They're the mad mullahs, after all. Donald Trump has completely demolished this argument as well. Despite a series of vicious escalations, Iran has remained calm and rational. They are clearly the adults in the room. The US and Israel have an ongoing program of assassinating highly placed figures in the Iranian military and science establishment, sometimes within Iran itself. Israel has stopped just short of bragging about a secret program of terrorism against Iranian civilian and nuclear infrastructure. And Iran just keeps on trucking. Iranians steadfastly refused to give up any aspect of the JCPOA until basic self-respect required them to. Over the past year, because of those assassinations and other Israeli terrorism, Iran has publicly, slowly, and quite consistently with its obligations, started taking steps out of compliance. At every point, they have made it clear that they will honor their full JCPOA obligations as soon as the United States honors its commitments. And Donald Trump has proved that Iran is infinitely more trustworthy on this topic than the United States is. Back in the Obama years, because he was so damn charming, it was easier to look like the good guys here. What Donald Trump has done is not just escalate the situation, but escalate the situation in such a way that it becomes obvious to anybody who doesn't read US media that Washington, D.C. is the problem here. Trump has made it obvious that we are the bad guys right now, but having reviewed the history, I kind of think we've always been the bad guys on this one. It's a standard thing to complain about the US-backed coup against Iran in 1953. Mohammad Mossadegh was democratically elected, we did it for oil, the Shah sucked, we supported the Shah, leading to the revolution in 1979, etc., etc. You've heard the story, I've mentioned it in videos before, but I don't think enough people pay attention to the relationship between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran after the revolution. If you dig into it a bit, it's kind of shocking. Like, the Iranian government has been super eager to make a deal with the United States for over 3 decades now. They just keep offering up stuff over and over, and the US burns them over and over again. Things got off to a bad start, obviously. They took some of our diplomats hostage, so we supported an aggressive war against them that killed 500,000 men, women, and children. But there's an interesting aspect of the 1980s that kind of gets ignored. During the Iran-Iraq War, Israel was one of Iran's largest arms suppliers. Like, you could probably make an argument that Israel saved the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, of course, Iran talked a ton of shit about Israel, even talking about how it had to be destroyed. This was because Iran is an Islamic country. This standard rhetoric was also spouted by all of those Arab countries that were supposed to be so excited about Donald Trump making signed deals with Israel. Some of them were spouting that rhetoric quite recently, actually. This standard rhetoric didn't get in the way of Israel selling a ton of weapons to Iran. Because back then, the world and foreign policy generally was a lot more serious. Back in the 1980s, Israel faced real serious threats. The Soviet Union heavily backed the Arab countries, most of whom, most famously Iraq, were publicly committed to Israel's destruction. And thanks to Gulf money, Iraq looked like a real military threat to Israel back then. Weirdly, today's Israeli obsession with Iran came about because Israel got so much safer in the early 1990s. With the humiliation of Saddam in the first Gulf War and the evaporation of the Soviet Union, Israel was running out of enemies. Even worse, under President Rafsanjani, Iran recognized that the world had changed after the Cold War and that his country should probably try to resolve its differences with Israel and Iran. He backed off on his support for Hezbollah, the anti-Israel Shia militia in Lebanon, and he even invited a U.S. oil company to start a project in Iran. Israel really didn't want this peacemaking to happen, and at the beginning at least, this approach actually made a kind of sense. The Israeli government also knew that a more peaceful world would require some changes. They had to make some kind of peace deal with the Palestinians. But they couldn't sell the Oslo Accords to the Israeli public without arguing that they were needed because of some other threat. So they intentionally rejected Iran's overtures, opting for peace with Palestine over peace with Iran. As Trita Parsi points out, the fight between Israel and Iran didn't really start in 1979. It started in 1992 because Israel desperately needed an enemy. Sadly, Rafsanjani, offended that his overtures had been rejected, struck back hard. Support for Shia Hezbollah was restored and expanded, and Iran built relationships with Sunni opponents of Israel, like Hamas, that it had never had before. My country eagerly jumped on the anti-Iran bandwagon. The United States was running out of enemies too. The Clinton administration came up with a dual containment strategy, arguing that Iran was just as bad as Iraq, a country that had invaded two of its neighbors over the past 15 years, and the U.S. government blocked that Iranian deal with that U.S. oil company. It's really striking to me how both the U.S. and Israel had to take extremely unreasonable positions to keep the animosity with Iran going. We see this everywhere with the United States. The post-Cold War environment is so favorable to us that we have to take extremely unreasonable and anti-diplomatic positions to keep any of these fights going. It's a really difficult thing to do, but somehow we keep pulling it off. I understand why Israel did this, and who knows, for peace with the Palestinians, maybe it was even worth it. But I have zero sympathy for my own government on this. Israel perpetrated this fraud so it could get to the Oslo Accords. But we jumped on just so we could sell more weapons. And after 9/11, we turned down two extremely generous peace overtures from Tehran. I think most people know that after 9/11, the Iranian public went to vigils for the victims, and that's very nice. But did you know that the Iranian government helped the United States win the war in Afghanistan in 2001? Iran had always been opposed to the Taliban, and they leapt at the chance to be useful to the United States and hopefully end their international isolation. Iran not only helped the U.S. connect with the Northern Alliance, in a December 2001 conference, Iran was vital to establishing the first post-war Afghan government, arguably the most stable Afghanistan has had in the past 4 decades. And what was Iran's reward for this extraordinary collaboration all the way through December 2001? Well, in January of 2002, Bush claimed that Iran was part of an axis of evil with its biggest enemy, Iraq and North Korea. After the Bush administration conquered Iraq in 2003, Iran made one last extraordinary offer. The Iranian government was rightly terrified, so they offered Bush basically everything. They offered an end to support for Sunni opponents of Israel and the disarmament of Shia Hezbollah. They even offered to join the Arab peace deal for Israel, promising recognition. They offered inspections of their nuclear program that were far more sweeping than the ones they eventually agreed to with the JCPOA. It was amazing, and the Bush administration arrogantly threw it away, confident that they would soon be able to destroy Iran the same way they had crushed Iraq. Iran decided it had no choice but to defend itself, adding Shia militias to the Sunni insurgency that quickly made the U.S. invasion of Iraq the catastrophe we all know. Most agree that Bush's dissolution of the Iraqi military was his biggest blunder in Iraq, but I wonder if maybe this blowing off of peace with Iran was the second biggest mistake, or maybe even the biggest. Iran has been a stumbling block for U.S. empire in the Middle East, but that's because the U.S. and Israel forced it to be one. After a decade of blood and destruction, Obama was finally able to coax Iran back to the negotiating table, laboriously putting together the JCPOA after 7 years of almost constant effort. And then Donald Trump came into office and blew it all up again. We are not the good guys here. And more importantly, now everybody knows it. U.S. credibility is shot. Iran tells the world we are untrustworthy and power-mad, and it's getting harder and harder for our allies to disagree. Our aggression has created a number of conflict points, and the chance that one of them could tip over into war increases with every boneheaded move we make. And the fact that we now look like the bad guys makes it less and less likely that our allies will back us if one of these wars happen. A fact that also makes those wars more likely. The idea of the U.S. system finally failing because of a catastrophic war we bring upon ourselves may be attractive to some viewers, but ask yourself, who suffered the most when the British world system fell? It certainly wasn't the British. No, the world wars and their aftermath killed vastly more Indians, Chinese, Russians, Poles, Germans, and many other nationalities than it did Britons. You may not like the U.S. world system, but a catastrophic war is not the right way to end it. Rooting for U.S. foreign policy success this century often feels like falling down a hill, but I found some hope in an odd place recently. I just read Empire's Workshop, a book by Greg Grandin about the U.S. treatment of Latin America. This is not a book to make you feel good about U.S. history. It's a litany of horror, really. But there's this little 20-year break there in the middle of the 20th century. By the early 1930s, everybody in Latin America had gotten sick of the U.S.'s constant invasions. So FDR and his administration agreed to just stop. They renounced intervention and truly did back off for a decade or two and tried to interact with Latin America through diplomacy and aid, and it worked. The goodwill was incredible, and the U.S. had tremendous support from Latin America all through World War II and the founding of the United Nations. Within 2 decades, certainly by 1954, the U.S. found other ways to screw with Latin America and discard all that goodwill, but the lesson stands. People still really like the United States. It's probably not fair, but all we really have to do to regain the world's confidence is just stop. Stop invading countries. Stop sanctioning everybody. Stop being the bad guy. And that's what the JCPOA will allow us to do. Just stop for a minute. With the Iran nuclear deal, we'll be able to step back and rebuild our alliances. It could give us a chance to try to be peacemakers for once, instead of just war starters. I fear that without the JCPOA, we're going to just keep tumbling down that hill, and that won't be good for anybody. Hey there, in the last video, I made it clear that I don't really buy the idea that China is an imminent threat to the United States, at least not over the next decade or so. But what if I'm wrong? What if China really is ready to upend everything and invade Taiwan at some point over the next 5 years, the way all these US government and media figures are predicting? Well, if that's the case, then the most important thing the US government can do to guarantee Taiwan's security is get back into the Iran nuclear deal. So if China is going to invade Taiwan, it wants to win. That should go without saying. The consensus today is that the US can no longer defeat the Chinese Navy in the Taiwan Strait with a level of casualties that would be acceptable to the US public. I'm not so sure about that, but the topic deserves its own video, so for today, let's just say that that's the case. The US can't win in the Taiwan Strait. But there are many more dimensions to a potential war between the United States and China than just what happens off the coast of Taiwan. Militarily speaking, every point on the international trade routes will become an opportunity for the US Navy to choke off the food and raw materials China needs to function. More importantly, in the diplomatic sphere, a Taiwan invasion would instantly make the world more enthusiastic about this new Cold War that the US government has been failing to sell so far. There's only one scenario in which I can imagine China attacking Taiwan this decade, and that is a US war with Iran. A war like that would negate many of the advantages that the United States holds over China. It would obviously be a tremendous distraction, tying up a lot of the same sorts of resources that would be needed to defend Taiwan on the other side of Asia. Simultaneous war with China and Iran would be massively more complex, expensive, and bloody than simultaneous war in Iraq and Afghanistan. With two countries to focus on, controlling all of those sea lanes gets a lot more complex. With the US mired in two wars, Russia might take the opportunity, if not to pile in on the US, maybe to try its luck against Turkey and reorder Russia's access to the Mediterranean the way it's always wanted to. These military scenarios are all pretty grim, but the diplomatic consequences of a US war on Iran would be even more disastrous for the defense of Taiwan. Allies are essential to any U.S. strategy against China. Our relatively small population and distance from the world's emerging economic center in Asia make careful diplomacy necessary. When we are in tune with our allies, as we were back in 2016, China's range of motion on the world stage is closely limited. China was reduced to impotently pouring concrete into the sea and calling it power projection. But when Donald Trump took power in 2017, he set about ripping this U.S. international system apart. The way that Donald Trump blew up the Iran nuclear deal was uniquely insulting to our allies in Europe and Asia. You see, we didn't just sanction Iran on our own behalf, we also forced our allies to sanction Iran as well, very much against their will. When it comes to Iran, we don't treat our allies like friends, we treat them like subjects. Europe and Japan have become accustomed to operating in the world as quasi-vassal states to the US. But they really don't like having their noses rubbed in it. Earlier this year, the Trump administration unilaterally destroyed the Iran nuclear deal. Macron of France, Merkel of Germany, and some others angrily declared that this was impossible. It was a multilateral agreement, and Germany and France were sticking by it. German and French companies, however, didn't agree with them on that. What these European companies knew, and their leaders didn't, was that the United States has too much financial and legal power to be denied. The U.S. has the ability to ruin foreign companies under multiple laws for transactions that have nothing to do with the United States. It's Washington, D.C.'s world, and the rest of us are just living in it. Europe remains outraged over this. They haven't just preserved the JCPOA, they have also worked to construct diplomatic mechanisms that can work around U.S. financial power, not just in Iran, but everywhere else as well. If the United States stays out of the Iran nuclear deal and chooses to wage war on Iran, we're going to have very little support from our allies. This lack of support would, of course, transfer to a simultaneous war against China to defend Taiwan. After all of our allies have much larger economic relationships with China than they do with Iran. If the United States wants any allies at all in defending Taiwan from China, we have to get back into the JCPOA. Oh, and there's also the question of weapons. Many doubt that the U.S. Navy's 20th century weapons are all that useful for a 21st century battle over Taiwan. Modern missile technology might mean that aircraft carriers and manned jet fighters are completely obsolete. The Pentagon tells us that that's not true, but nobody knows because the defensive and offensive capabilities of our ships and planes are some of the most closely guarded secrets of the U.S. government. Well, the Strait of Hormuz and the Taiwan Strait are two very similar environments. When the US wars against China and Taiwan, they're going to be using pretty similar sets of tools. Even if a US war with Iran doesn't lead directly to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it will destroy the ambiguity about US naval power that is one of the cornerstones of Taiwan's defense. In a US war with Iran, everybody in the world is likely to get a pretty clear idea of what the US Navy truly is and is not capable of. So if the US government is truly interested in keeping Taiwan safe, the most important thing to do is get back into the JCPOA. Biden has hired the personnel that are necessary to do this. A lot of the folks who crafted the initial Iran nuclear deal are working for him today. All he has to do is decide to do it. One of the most common objections is that even if Biden jumps back into the Iran deal, Trump or some other Republican president will destroy it. This is a risk, of course, but I think the concern misses some important historical facts on timing. The Iran nuclear deal was signed in mid-2015, but it didn't even begin to be implemented until the beginning of 2016. Most of the benefits of JCPOA sanctions relief that Iran was supposed to get were going to come through international banks and businesses that agreed to open back up in Iran. But because that time frame was so short, most businesses decided to hang back and wait until Hillary Clinton was elected before they piled in. That never happened. But the Iran deal still exists today. There is no ramp up necessary. Biden just needs to remove Trump's sanctions and we are back in business. Even if Trump or Ted Cruz or Tom Cotton gets elected president in 2024, we still have 3.5 years before that Republican is in power. That's a serious chunk of time. As I pointed out on Tuesday, the point of the JCPOA is not just to deal with nukes, but to build the foundation for settling all of the US's messes in the Middle East. With barely a year between the beginning of the deal and the rise of Trump, none of that was possible in 2016. All of it is possible between 2021 and 2025. Even partial progress on any of these issues would make the end of the JCPOA much, much harder to bring about. Even back then, it took Trump over a year before he could take the US out of the JCPOA in mid-2018. Joe Biden needs to get back into this deal as soon as possible. It would be the best thing for the world, the best thing for the United States, and yes, the best thing for the security of Taiwan. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I would be grateful if you would sign up for my email list so I can reach out to you if the YouTube gods ever cast me out, for example, for videos like this one. You will also get a free PDF essay if you sign up. Thanks.